Hello and welcome back. This is the week 15 lecture, and this will be the final lecture of the semester. So today I just want to talk about the final paper and, of course, the final exam, which will be cumulative since we skipped the midterm. So we are finished with our texts. As I said last week, we basically finished up with all those texts that I posted back in the week 13 module. So in order to be caught up and in order to be fully prepared for these final two assignments, just make sure you've gotten through all of the reading that I posted in week 13. And prior to that, we were just finishing up Hope Leslie. So remember, I cut The Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. That was on our syllabus, that was on our original reading list and our original reading schedule. But because of time constraints and other factors, I went ahead and cut that text. So we are not responsible for it. It's not going to show up on the final exam. Okay, so of course, if you've already purchased the book in anticipation of reading it, go ahead and read it, if you get the chance, because it does fit in very well with what we've been doing in this class. And again, I originally intended for it to kind of go along with Hope Leslie, because they're both examples of frontier romances, but again, we just kind of ran out of time. So we are not worrying about Cooper and The Prairie. But remember, The Prairies, plural, the poem by William Cullen Bryant, that was one of the texts that I posted in week 13, and I do want you guys to read that. So everything you need to get ready is pretty much posted in the week 15 module. So I've published the final exam study guide, as I've mentioned to some of you already. It's pretty basic. I'm just listing all of the major texts that we've covered this semester, and you guys already know those. All of the major works, the novels, some of the poetry that we read early on is also included on the major text list. So I believe there are 9 major texts, and those are the ones that we've obviously talked the most about. And then there's also a minor text list, which I think includes maybe about 8. And again, those are some of the early things that we read back in week 1 before we got started on the Coquette. A few other smaller pieces that I kind of sprinkled in, some of that Southwestern humor, the old Southwestern humor that we saw in week 13. Bryant's poem, The Prairies, I think is there on the minor text list. A few other things that I might have mentioned briefly in lecture or maybe in the modules, but we just didn't really spend very much time on otherwise. So you guys will be able to make sense of it. The major texts are obviously the ones that you really need to know. You need to make sure that you've read them all. The minor texts, you probably won't have to really discuss a lot of those on the final, but they might be, a couple of them might be featured in the ID section. So I'll talk more about that in a moment. So just take a look at the study guide underneath all of the texts, and you'll notice I've included titles, authors, and years of publication. So you are responsible for all of that info, but I've provided it all for you on the study guide. So that's really all you need to be able to study. Obviously, make sure to read the texts, and then a lot of the key info is there. And underneath those text lists, I've also included a list of sort of key concepts, some of the big ideas that we've been talking about all semester. These are some of the key literary genres that we've been looking at, some key themes and motifs. Just stuff that's come up a lot, big concepts, things that really matter in the early development of U.S. literature. So again, if you've been watching my lectures, if you've been, keeping up with the reading and keeping up with the stuff that I've been posting in the modules, those concepts should look familiar to you. And for some of the harder or more obscure ones, I tried to kind of direct you to the text that we talked about in relation to that concept. So I put, hybridity and transatlantic sort of stuff on there, but we really only talked about those concepts in relation to Reuben and Rachel. So I put the title in parentheses next to the concept. When I get down to sort of some like 18th century styles and literary traditions that are getting adapted in the early days of U.S. Lit, I try to point you to the specific authors that we talked about or the texts that we talked about when we were discussing those particular styles or those particular sort of 18th century techniques that were still popular, still around in the early days of American Lit, but we're sort of undergoing some change in certain interesting ways. And again, we talked about that a lot. So you'll see on the list a lot of genres, the Gothic romance, the frontier romance, sentimental novels. Make sure you're familiar with those genres. We've been talking a lot about genres in this class, so I expect you guys to be conversant when it comes to those terms. So again, go back to the appropriate modules, go back to the appropriate lectures, and just make sure you're comfortable with all of those concepts that I've included on the study guide. Again, these are things that I've talked about a lot in lecture, and I've also occasionally posted some stuff about them in the module, so they shouldn't be new. They shouldn't look brand new. Just kind of refresh your memory, go back through our stuff, and if you have any questions, of course, let me know. So let me just talk a little bit about the final exam format. I don't want to spend too much time on the exam. I want to talk a little bit more about the final paper. But let's just cover the exam format. Those of you who took me in 451, it's the same format. I really only know one way to do a literary or a literature exam. So I have 3 sections. I kind of always do it this way in all of my 400 level classes. So section 1, identification. Pretty simple. This is my way to just sort of determine, to make sure that you guys have done the reading. So I'm going to give you, I think, 14 different passages taken from the text that we've read over the course of the semester. You choose 10. You don't have to do all 14, and in fact, I don't want you to do all 14. That would take a little too long. So you select 10 of those passages, and you simply identify them by telling me the title of the text, where the passage comes from. Also mention the name of the author who wrote the text. Last name only is fine. I don't necessarily need the full name, but you got to give me something. And then year of publication. And if you're a year or 2 off, that's not the end of the world. Just try to, indicate to me that you have a general idea of when this text was published. And then the final thing you need to provide is a brief 1 to 2 sentence explanation of the significance of the passage. So you don't need to get into a lot of plot summary. Again, I just want 1 or 2 sentences. And all of these instructions, of course, are on the exam itself, but you just need to be efficient and quickly establish sort of what's going on in the passage, why it matters. I'm not picking mundane passages, right? I'm mostly selecting, passages that should be familiar. I'm trying to avoid dead giveaways, but most of these passages should be familiar because important stuff is happening in them, or these might be passages in many cases that I've discussed in lecture because important stuff is happening in them. So again, these are passages that I've talked about, that I've maybe pointed you to in lecture, and if you've read, if you're familiar and comfortable with the texts, you shouldn't have too much trouble. But I recognize that some passages are more difficult to pick out than others. That's why I give you 14 or maybe even 15, I can't remember, and then you select 10. Okay? So again, title of the text, author of the text, year of publication, and 1 to 2 sentences on the significance. That's it. You need to move through the ID section relatively quickly. Again, you have to do 10 of these, so you don't really want to write a ton. Save most of your writing for the second section, and then obviously the essay section, which is the third and final section. So the IDs aren't meant to be super, extensive. You're not going to cover everything in your explanation. Just point out kind of what's going on and why it matters, okay? And keep it relatively succinct. Then you move on to your second section, which is the short answer. So I'm asking for a higher level of specificity here, and in many ways these questions, some questions are about specific texts that we've read, major texts that we've read. But other questions in the short answer section will just kind of ask you to talk about genres or major developments that we've observed, or you might have a chance to talk about multiple texts. So with short answer, I'm asking for 3 to 4 sentences in response. And you need to do 5 of the 8 short answer that I provide. I'll have 8 questions. You answer 5 of them. 3 to 4 sentences, so that's like a short paragraph. That's like a short self-contained paragraph. That's what you need as a response to each of the 5 that you answer. Okay, so this is going to be a little more involved, and you're going to be spending a little bit more time on the short answer than maybe you did on the ID section. That's kind of by design. So both the ID section and the short answer section are both worth 50 points. So the IDs, each one is worth 5, each one that you complete. And then with the short answer, each one will be worth, 10, I guess, right? You'll do 5 answers. Each one will be worth 10 points. So you can see how the math works. Again, the short answer is not only going to sort of test your knowledge of the texts, but it's also going to test your knowledge of some of those key concepts and sort of themes and overarching ideas that I included on the study guide. So just be aware of that. I want a little more than just talking about specific characters or specific texts. In some cases, you are going to be doing some of that in the short answer, but you're also going to be asked to kind of tackle some more big picture stuff, if that makes sense. Maybe talk about an entire genre that might give you a chance to talk about 2 texts as opposed to just 1. So you're going to be a little bit more diverse, maybe a little bit more sort of wide-reaching with your answers in the short answer section. But again, you don't need to write short novels. 3 to 4 sentences will be fine. If you go a little bit beyond that, that's okay. But you sort of want these to be short paragraph answers. You don't need to write more than a single short paragraph. Okay, but make sure you do 5 of those. Again, I'm giving you options. So if you don't like the sound of a few of them, you can avoid those and tackle the 5 that you feel good about. And then finally, the third section is the essay section. So that's worth 100 points. This exam essay is kind of going to be on par lengthwise with our critical response papers. So I'm assuming most of you are going to be typing these up. So I would like you to shoot for at least, between 2 to 3 pages in a Word doc. I mean, our critical responses have been around 3 pages typically, so if you could shoot for something comparable to that for the essay exam, that would be good. I'll give you 2 prompts. You choose the one you like best. And again, these are going to be pretty general prompts because I want you to be able to sort of direct your answer to whichever texts you like best. So obviously you guys are responsible for all of the texts we've read, but on the essay, I want you to be able to write about something that you enjoy, something that you really are interested in. So both prompts are going to give you some room to operate. You'll be able to choose from a variety of authors and texts, and you can kind of tailor that answer to what you know best, to what you're most comfortable with, to what you're most interested in. All right, so again, I don't expect the the exam essay to be as detailed or as thorough or as specific as the final paper. And that's kind of an important thing that I want to talk more about today because, of course, the exam is closed book. Closed book exam. And normally it would be a proctored exam. But because of our current circumstances, I'm not going to require that, but I am just going to ask that everybody abide by the honor system. And I'm just going to have to trust you guys to not use your books while you're taking the exam. Now, obviously, when you're studying, you can use my study guide. You can go back through the books, back through my lectures, back through the modules. And also, you can prepare a note card. I don't have one handy. I should have been more prepared. This is an old-fashioned, I thought I might have some in here. An old-fashioned, I think maybe 8 by 10 inch note card is kind of the standard format. That's what we used to do in the old days. It seems kind of silly now, but again, I don't want you guys using the internet while you're taking the exam. I don't want you to use the books. I don't want you to even use your notes, really. That's all fair game when you're doing the final paper, of course. And we'll talk more about the paper in a moment. But when you're doing the exam, the whole idea is I'm testing your knowledge. I'm testing what you remember, what you know from the readings that you've done and from all the work that you've done over the course of the semester. So let's just stick to the honor system. But just keep this in mind. This is kind of my final thought on the exam. There's a certain expectation level as far as the level of detail that we want to see and typically do see on a final exam. So generally, with the exam essay, I'm not going to expect you to necessarily provide direct quotes from the text that you're discussing. I would sort of expect your examples, your textual evidence to be a little more general and a little bit more broad because you're not looking at the book, right? The book isn't open in front of you. So you're operating based on your memory, based on what you've written down on your note card. So a lot of students use their note card, and you can just use a scrap piece of paper or whatever. I don't mind you having a little bit of notes in front of you, notes that you've taken in preparation for the exam based on my study guide, based on what I'm telling you right now. And you can use that little piece of paper or that 8 by 10 inch note card. And typically students will write down stuff on that note card that will help them with the IDs because it's hard to remember all of those names, all of those years, all of those exact titles. So you might want to jot some of the ID information down on your note card. But also, like I said, you can kind of choose the text that you write about on the final essay. I mean, you have to work within my parameters, but like I said, I'm giving you a lot of room to kind of direct the answer to what you want to do based on what text you want to write about. So I would recommend having an idea of maybe 2 or 3 of our major texts that you definitely would like to write about on the final essay and write down some specific notes about those texts. Some key scenes or passages that you might want to mention, maybe some character names, maybe just some important plot points, just stuff that you can mention in your essay, just stuff that you can talk about because, again, you're going to be operating off of memory, which can make it sometimes difficult to get really specific. So on a typical exam that's proctored or, of course, in the old days, taken in a classroom, there's sort of a certain level of specificity that we generally see in the answers. And it's not going to be the same high level of specificity that we see on a final paper. So just be aware of that difference. Your final paper should be more specific, more detailed, and more sort of reliant on direct evidence from the text, because again, when you're writing your final paper, you have the texts in front of you. But when I'm grading your exam, if I see a sort of final paper level of specificity in the exam, that's a little bit of a red flag. That's kind of counterintuitive, I know, because we typically want that high level of specificity. But again, if you're not using any of your resources and you're taking the final exam on the up and up, there will be a certain kind of broadness, a certain level of generality that is to be expected, because you don't have all your notes in front of you. Again, you don't have your books open. You're not looking on the internet at summary sites. So again, we'll stick to the honor code. I will have my plagiarism detector turned on, so I'll be able to tell if you're pulling anything from websites. Now, obviously, I won't be able to tell if you're just looking at the coquette while you write about the coquette. I will just ask you, sincerely, to please not do that. And, just do the best you can with your note card or with your scrap paper. Okay, so again, take a look at the study guide. Let me know if you have any questions. And, the way this exam is designed, it's really intended to be taken in between like 2 and 3 hours. I know I don't really have any control over how you guys choose to take this or how long you spend on it, but this is kind of formatted like an old-fashioned in-class exam where students would typically have maybe 2.5 hours to do it. So that's kind of what I want you guys to do. It's meant to be done in a single sitting. Now, it's not meant to be done in a half an hour or even just 1 hour, but it is kind of meant to be done in a single block of time. Now, of course, you can take breaks. You can get up after you're finished with the IDs or after you're finished with the short answer. You can get up and make yourself a glass of water or whatever, get a snack, take a walk. I mean, whatever you need to do to work at your sort of optimal level. But I really don't recommend dragging it out for multiple days, because I want you to spend more time on the final paper. And I want to turn our attention now to the final paper. So yeah, ideally with the exam, just sit down and try to get it done, if not in a single sitting, then at least in a single day. Maybe you do the first couple of sections early in the day, and then you write your essay later in the day. Remember, just choose one of the 2 essay prompts on the exam. So and you can do these in whatever order you want, because as I mentioned, I think I mentioned this last week, but if not, I'll make sure to mention it now. Both the final exam and the final paper are due by May 21st, which is the Friday of exam week. So not this coming Friday, but the Friday of next week. So you just need to get both in by that date. My recommendation, I would do the final exam first. Again, it's less of a time commitment. I think it's going to be a little bit easier than writing the final paper, but I don't know. Everybody's different, and everybody has their own feelings about what's hard or what's not. But I would just knock out the exam first, because even if you do find it somewhat difficult, it shouldn't take you as long. Again, it's not designed to take you as long as the final paper. So I would just like to get the exam out of the way kind of early on. You can even do it this week, because again, we don't have any new readings. So everything that's on there, you hopefully you have it finished by now. There's nothing new to read here in week 15. So, but again, regardless, you can do the exam first, you can do it second. Just make sure you have both the paper and the exam submitted by the 21st, by midnight on the 21st. That's really as late as I can wait for any work because grades are due, I think, the following Monday or Tuesday. So I'll be grading that whole weekend, and I need everything by Friday. So the final paper, let's talk more about that because it's worth more points than the final exam. And like I've said, I want you to devote more time to the final paper. The final paper is a little more important to me. It's a little more interesting to me. The exam is really just testing your knowledge of the reading and just making sure that you've done the reading, that you're comfortable and familiar with these texts. So again, you don't have to study for it all that much. Just use my study guide and use the reading that you've done. But with the final paper, it's more of your chance to kind of be a literary critic or scholar, at least for a little while. And some of you might have aspirations to one day do more of this kind of work. But in a 400 level class, we need to do some high level literary analysis. So we've done a couple of critical responses to kind of practice our techniques, to tackle some of these texts, to try to develop some original interpretations and readings of these texts. So we've gotten some practice. You guys have done this kind of work in previous English classes. So we need to do it here at the end in a sort of well-developed, detailed way. So I want you to think of the final paper in terms of what you're doing, your goals, your purpose. I want you to think of it in many ways as pretty similar to the critical responses. I mean, we're doing the same kind of work. Close reading, taking a look at historical and cultural contexts, offering specific examples from the text to support our claims, our interpretations, our ideas, trying to advance an original argument of our own based on what we see, what we think, but we are adding a little bit more to the mix now. So we're doing some research. You're going to bring in some scholarly sources that will help you to develop your argument. So now you're not strictly relying on your own ideas and the examples from the text. You can also bring in some further scholarly or critical support, which will make your argument even stronger. So we're doing the same kind of work that we've been doing, only now we are doing more of it. We are doing it on a larger scale. And that means that you need to sort of dig into a little bit more than maybe what we've been doing thus far. So you'll have an opportunity to pick whichever text you want to write about, any text that we've read over the course of the semester. In certain cases, and I would like you guys, again, I'm going to be reading your proposals soon, so we'll talk more about your ideas, and if I have any adjustments that I want to make, we can discuss those. But if you're going to talk about two separate texts, that's doable. It's a little bit more of a challenge, I think, because this is still a relatively short essay that we're writing. We're not writing a true, the length of a typical scholarly paper would be more in the neighborhood of 15, 20, maybe 25 pages, or certainly if we were going to write a book, as we could do on a lot of these texts. So we're still tackling a relatively small length here, but if you're going to tackle two texts, you need to find some kind of commonality, some kind of shared characteristic or quality or literary device that you can really dig into in relation to both texts. This might also work with a sort of genre exploration. If you wanted to talk about two examples of sentimental novels or two sort of visions of frontier romance, and you had multiple texts that you could use to kind of illustrate, that could work. But a lot of times we just want to stick with a single text, and we're going to need to develop a lot of ideas, a lot of original claims about that text. So again, you have to be somewhat diverse and a little bit broad in your approach. You can't just, it depends. How much do you have to say? But it might be good to not simply choose a single character or a single theme or a single setting that you find interesting within a particular text, but grab a few more features and try to find relationships between them. And again, use your scholarship, use the research that you've been doing to sort of help you with this. So, if you're looking at Reuben and Rachel, you might be interested in historical fiction, the way she's perhaps using that genre or distorting that genre, abusing it. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there with historical fiction. We talked about how that genre was pretty new in America at that time. Like, U.S. readers kind of knew what it was because they had seen versions of it from England and other parts of Europe, but it wasn't really a popular genre yet in the U.S. when Rowson was writing in the 1790s. So you could do a lot with historical fiction, but don't just grab one representative scene or one representative moment in the text. You're going to need a lot. Give us characters, give us themes, give us scenes, maybe motifs as well. Whatever you find that can help you build an argument about the thing that you are interested in. So you're making an original argument here, like we've been trying to do in the critical responses. This is your interpretation of the text. This is what critics and scholars do. Right? They read texts, they make an argument, they stake out an original claim about what the text does, what the text means, why the text is significant, and then they use evidence from the text in the form of quotes, specific moments that they can point to, scenes they can describe, and of course they consult other scholars, other critics, and they bring that stuff in as evidence as well. So we're doing that work. We are doing that same work with the text that we like best from this class. So that's a big part of the reason I want you guys to do the research, and I wanted you guys to get started on your research last week, not just so you can have additional evidence, but that is important. Also, so you can just kind of see what this looks like, what this kind of work looks like when, professionals do it. If you're looking on the databases, if you're using Google Scholar, you're going to find good scholarship written by professors, in some cases critics, but in a lot of cases scholars, right? Scholars of American literature who have done a lot of work in the field, a lot of research, a lot of reading. They teach these texts, they know these texts. So just by looking at their work, you sort of have a model that you can use when doing your own work. I don't expect your work to necessarily be the same as theirs. Obviously, they're professionals, they've been doing it a lot longer, but we are engaged in the same basic task. And I want a high level of specificity. I want a lot of examples from the text. So before you choose the text that you are going to write about, make sure that you've read it, all of it. Make sure that you've annotated, highlighted some passages. And that's another thing I wanted to talk about today before you guys sit down to start writing. And I hope you've maybe already gotten into the habit of doing this in previous English classes, maybe in previous literature classes. But one thing that I would always recommend, once you've selected the text that you want to write about, sit down before writing and simply go through the text and find stuff that you want to use. I really think this is some of the best advice I can give literature students, and this is a step that a lot of lit students skip, and they think they can just sit down and start writing the draft once they've picked their text and maybe come up with a basic idea. Okay, I want to talk about the role of women in 1790s society, or I want to talk about how Brown is updating the Gothic romance to American subject matter, or whatever. Okay, so all right, I'm ready. I got my text. I know what I think I want to say, kind of. I'm going to sit down and start writing. to me, that makes your life a lot more difficult than it needs to be, because you're skipping a really important step. In order to do this kind of literary analysis, you really have to get specific. So I dropped my pen here. I was going to model some of this work for you guys, so I know you know what I mean. But if you look, if you look at the text typically owned by English professors, grad students, people who have been doing the work for a long time, and a lot of undergrads too, anyone who's a close and careful reader, you're going to mark up your text. I know you guys can't really see this, but I always mark up my texts. I underline, I highlight, I annotate, and I do that while I'm reading, because it helps to pick out the most important stuff just in case I need to come back and use it later. But once I've selected the text that I'm going to write about for my paper, before I write anything, I'm going to sit down with my text, go back through it. I don't have to reread it, let me be clear. If I've already read it once, I don't necessarily have to read it again, especially if it's a novel. I might want to reread particular chapters or particular passages, but I don't need to reread the whole thing. I probably don't have time for that. But if I've already highlighted and annotated, that's going to help, because I can go back and find some of my own notes, some of the passages that I've already marked as important or interesting or cool or whatever. So maybe I can use some of that. But now I'm kind of looking at the text through a new lens, because I know what I want to write about. So before, I was just reading it and trying to understand it and making notes as I went along. But now I know exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for evidence that's going to help me make my points and support my argument. Now, I haven't fully worked out my argument yet, but I have a general idea of what it is. So I have a general idea of what I'm looking for. And I might discover new things as I'm looking, and that's fine. But you need to go back to the text before you start writing. And you need to underline, highlight, use brackets, put stuff in boxes, triangles, whatever. But you need to find scenes, symbols, motifs, characters, settings, whatever. Sometimes I just find lines of dialogue that I might like to use as a quote. I mean, it can be small stuff, big stuff, but you need to find as many specific things in the text as possible. You might not use all of them in the actual essay, but you need to have a lot of options. These are examples that you can use, these are quotes that you can use, and these are just things in some cases that you might summarize. Like you might just point to something. Hey, remember in chapter 8 when they burned the city down? Remember this happened and then this happened? Well, here's why that matters. Here's how I'm reading those events. Here's the significance of those events. So this is just practical literary analysis work. This is the grunt work. Before the glory of a good essay, you have to do the grunt work of going back through the text and saying, okay, I'm going to talk about this. And again, you have to get specific. So this way, you're going to be able to give us the specific details that we need. This moment in this chapter, at this point in the plot, when this character does this. And again, that's the kind of detail that I don't expect on the final exam, but I do expect on the final paper. Because of course, when you're writing the final paper, please, for the love of God, have your text open and in front of you and be looking at it, be looking at your notes. Be looking at everything that you've done when you went back through the text to find all the features that you want to discuss. Okay, so that's kind of step one. And then once you've done that, I recommend doing an outline. And I know at this level, a lot of us might think, well, I don't need to do an outline. That's Mickey Mouse. That's for, 101 or 102. But I don't think so. I think outlining is a useful activity really for all writers, and sure, some don't really do it. I still outline. What I like about outlining is you don't have to be formal about it. I still do mine by hand. I mean, that might be a little old fashioned. I always type up my drafts, of course, on a computer. But when I outline, that's just sometimes I do it like in the margins of the book or just on some scrap paper. I just hammer out some really brief sketch, but you need a plan. And that's another step that students often skip is the outlining step because that's the blueprint for your essay. That's why I think it's bad to skip it. And a lot of people don't think it's necessary. Oh, okay, I'm ready to draft. I know what I want. But you need a brief plan to guide you as you get started on your draft. So in my outlines, I just write little sentence fragments or bullet points about what I want to do in each paragraph. And I don't know exactly how many paragraphs I'm going to have total, but I know some things. I know I'm going to have an intro paragraph. I know I'm going to have multiple body paragraphs. I don't know the exact number, but it's going to be a pretty long paper. So I'm not going to just have two. I know I'm going to have more than three, maybe more than four. So maybe I'll plan five for now. And again, I'm not writing the paragraphs yet. I'm just mentioning what I think I want to talk about in that paragraph. So first I have an idea of my intro. Okay, what's my thesis going to be? Obviously, I'll introduce my text, the name of the author, the year it came out, offer maybe a sentence or two of bio, just a little background. That's nice for the intro paragraph. So I can plan all of that. Plan my thesis, at least have like a rough draft of my thesis kind of plugged in there to where it's going to go eventually in the intro paragraph, and then plan as many bodies as I can based on what I'm planning to do. So again, I found a bunch of stuff that I'm going to talk about. So in my first body, I'm going to talk about the battle scene in chapter 8. Second body, I'm going to talk about this particular character that's important to my interpretation, and I'm going to really get into the character in this second body, and maybe I have a lot to say about that character. Maybe one of my sources also talks about that character. So as I'm planning, I decide, you know what, I actually have a lot of stuff on this guy, so I'm going to devote 2 body paragraphs to this character. So I'll devote my second and third bodies to this guy. Okay, moving on, fourth body, and that's what I mean. Just a quick plan, and it can be a little bit based on your sources, and it can be based on what you found in your text. And say, oh, I'm going to talk about this scene here. I'm going to talk about this symbol here. I'm going to talk about this theme for multiple paragraphs because I have a lot to say. Whatever. Just have a rough plan. You don't have to be married to it. It's always a little bit subject to change, but it's nice to have that outline sitting next to you or pulled up on your screen as you start working on a rough draft. And again, things will change as you start drafting. You might decide, no, I actually don't have enough for multiple bodies on that topic or that particular device. I'm just going to spend one body on it. But that's okay. I mean, you can make those alterations as you go, as you work. But trust me, sitting down in front of a blank screen with nothing planned, with nothing marked up in your book, with just an idea in your head, that's a really tough way to get started on a rough draft. And I really do want you guys to produce at least 2 distinct drafts for this final essay. So I want you to have a rough draft that you're able to work with, and you can certainly send it to me. I'm not making you guys turn in your rough draft. I do that with my, freshmen. I don't really require rough drafts to come in at this level, but I'm always happy to offer feedback on anybody's rough draft, but you can just email it to me. We're going to kind of do it off the books. We won't do it in Canvas, but I'm always happy to look at a rough draft, and I'll email you back with some feedback. But even if you don't involve me, if you have a trusted friend or a family member who might take a look, it's always good to have another set of eyes, on a draft. But produce that rough draft and then take some time for post writing. So all the stuff I was talking about a few moments ago, marking up your book, finding stuff to talk about, and then outlining, that's all considered pre-writing. You guys have probably learned about the writing process before. Pre-writing is all the stuff you do before you start drafting. And then you have post-writing, which is all the stuff that you do after you're finished with a rough draft. So post-writing means revision and editing. So we know what editing means. That's just eliminating mistakes. So obviously you want to do that. Proofread, eliminate the sentence level errors, at least as many as possible. Make sure your in-text citations are correct. Remember, we are using MLA citation style here. I mentioned that in the final paper instructions. You need in-text citations. You also need a works cited page at the end of the paper. So just don't forget, that's pretty standard, and we've done it before, but just don't forget here. Editing is just making sure everything looks right, eliminating most of the mistakes, making sure your formatting looks good, your citations look good, not too many grammatical or punctuation errors. A few always slip through, but we want to be as clean and correct as possible. So we all kind of get editing, but people overlook revision. Revision is a little different than editing. Revision is just more about making general sort of improvements to your draft. And that might mean reworking certain sentences, reworking certain body paragraphs, maybe rearranging bodies. You might not have them in the sequence that you want them in right away. You might need to move them around, work on your intro a little bit, work on your concluding paragraph a little bit, whatever. That's what revision means, and it can be a lot of different things. Sometimes you're making cuts. You might be eliminating some content that's not working very well. In other cases, you might need to add some content. You might be a little short of the length requirement. It's okay if the rough draft is a little short. You can always add another body paragraph. You can always extend and elaborate more on what you have. So, or if you can't really elaborate more on what you have, you might need to find one more scene, one more literary element, one more thing to talk about so you can build one or two additional bodies. But if you give yourself enough time, if you have a rough draft completed and you still have at least a few days before the final draft is due, you can sit down and really revise and edit that rough draft. Polish it, get it in good shape, and then you can submit your final draft by the 21st. So really, post-writing is about turning rough drafts into final drafts. And a lot of times we skip that stage, so what I end up grading often looks a lot like rough drafts. They look promising, the ideas are good, but not a lot of revision, not a lot of editing, and if the student also skipped the pre-writing and didn't really outline, then the organization is probably not very good either. So I see a lot of papers that have good ideas, some good examples from the text. Again, there's potential, but if you don't outline, you're not going to be organized, and you're probably going to drift and ramble and lose your thread. And if you don't revise and edit, you're going to have a lot of mistakes, maybe citation issues, and you're going to have those rough patches that are not always going to be easy for readers. So this is not just about actually creating the draft. I hope you guys are kind of taking that away here. A final takeaway: we need to do some work before we draft, and then we also need to do some work after we've drafted. So again, give yourself more time for the final paper. And you guys are the masters of your own schedules, so you need to figure it out. Again, the final exam can be done within 2 to 3 hours. So keep that in mind, and that's really how it's designed. The final paper should take you multiple days. If it's done right, it should take multiple days. Do not try to cram it all into one day. Again, that's not how it's designed. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'm looking forward to reading your proposals and critical summaries. I'm recording this, over the weekend, so week 14 is not quite over yet, but as soon as those come in, I'll take a look, I'll try to turn them around and get them back to you maybe by the Friday of week 15. So maybe a little sooner if I can. Well, yeah, there's only 6 of you, so I can get them turned around by midweek. So you'll have feedback from me quickly on your proposal. So you'll know if your idea for the final paper will work. I'll try to offer some suggestions if necessary in my feedback, but if any of you want to talk more about the final paper or the final exam, if you have any questions, we can always set up a video conference during the last week, or we can just correspond through email. So get in touch with me if you need anything. Good luck getting all of your final work done. I hope you guys have had some fun this semester. I hope you've learned some new things about early U.S. literature and how weird and sort of heterogeneous it was. So hopefully this has been illuminating in some ways. You've discovered some new texts, some new authors. I had a good time. So good luck. Please get in touch with me if you guys need anything. I'm very available throughout week 15 and throughout exam week, which is week 16. So I'm here, we can talk, and I look forward to seeing your work. So have a great break, and I'll probably see some more of you soon.